Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us here today. I can see on the bottom of the screen that we've got quite a few people all joining now. So we'll give it another minute or so as we've got those numbers climbing, and then we will formally begin. So thank you all for coming. So I think we'll make a start now. It's 1 minute past. So welcome to today's event with Deaf Child Worldwide. Before we formally begin, and I go through a couple of bits of information, we're going to start by showing you an animation that demonstrates who Deaf Child Worldwide are and what we do. So we'll just begin with that. Thank you all so much for being here today. And can I welcome you all to the launch of Deaf Child Worldwide's Unheard Children report. I'm Nick Try and I'll be facilitating today's event. Before we begin, can I just remind everyone that we have captions in English for the event today. The link for this was shared in the email that you received this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, depending where you are in the world. We have also had the link posted in the chat box at the bottom of your screen as well. So if you click on that, you'll be able to see the captions for today. We also have international sign interpreters with us here today as well. And do play around with the settings on your Zoom account, because you can make the international signers bigger or smaller depending on your preferences. Finally, if you have any questions at all, please do post them in the Q&A box. If they're about the format of the event or a technical question, we'll try and answer those as quickly as possible. But also, if you've got any questions for the question and answer session to the panel at the end, do put them there as you think of those questions, and we'll try and get through as many of those as possible. So to formally begin today's event, can I introduce Susan Daniels? Susan is the Chief Executive of the National Deaf Children's Society and Deaf Child Worldwide. She is deaf herself and was awarded an OBE for services to deaf children and their families. She's been a Commissioner of the Disability Rights Commission and previously chaired the UK Council on Deafness, and was instrumental in setting up the newborn hearing screening programme for children in the UK and chairs its advisory group. But most importantly, Susan has spent her life working with deaf children, their families, and the professionals who support them to break down the multiple different barriers they experience as they grow up. So it's my pleasure to introduce Susan to launch today's event.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. So welcome to the launch of Deaf Child Worldwide's Unheard Children report. I'm Susan Daniels, the Chief Executive of the National Deaf Children's Society, of which Deaf Child Worldwide is our international arm. Can I just firstly say what an absolute pleasure it is to have you all here today. We have so many people representing over 100 organisations, collectively working with more than 20,000 deaf children growing up in low-income countries around the world. As a deaf person myself, and someone who, as Nick said, has spent my life working to break down the barriers that deaf children face, it's really fabulous to see such a huge number of people wanting to know more about how to support deaf children in some of the poorest communities in the world, but also to witness how much important work is already taking place in every corner of the world. So we have members of Parliament in the UK, members of the House of Lords, chief executives, academics, programme specialists, civil servants, inclusive education programme managers, teachers, people from community organisations, to some of the world's biggest NGOs. We really do have a multiplicity of experts here today. Whilst my colleague Joanna Clark, Director of Deaf Child Worldwide, will be introducing the findings of this report, I just want to introduce you briefly to the work of Deaf Child Worldwide, who we are, what we do, and what our vision entails. The National Deaf Children's Society has been in existence for over 75 years, having been set up by a group of parents who met during the Blitz in London to form the charity. We're the world's largest NGO working with deaf children, their parents, and the professionals who support them. Although our trust deed allowed us to work beyond the UK, traditionally we had focused our support to families across the United Kingdom. However, over the years, hundreds of organisations around the world came to us asking for our support and advice. There was no other organisation with the expertise, programme knowledge, or capacity to help. This is the context in which Deaf Child Worldwide was born. In some of the least developed communities in the world, where deaf children are at highest risk of neglect, abuse, and fail to receive an education, we work with organisations large and small, as well as governments, to develop projects that can break down the barriers that these children face. Too many of them never learn language, whether signed or spoken. Too many never can communicate with their families, let alone their wider community. Too many never make it into the classroom, and for those that do, their lessons are rarely accessible to them. And as these barriers build up, long-term inequalities are entrenched. But with the right support from the start, that doesn't have to be the case. And we have shown time and time again in the projects that we support that each of these barriers can be broken down, and there is nothing to stop deaf children from leading fulfilled and successful lives. To do this, Deaf Child Worldwide doesn't parachute into countries where we don't understand the local cultural context. We don't set up and deliver our own projects and programs. Instead, we have a model built entirely on partnerships. We know that the most large organisations working with tens of thousands of beneficiaries won't have the in-house expertise to make sure that all of our programs are designed to be as effective as possible for the relatively small numbers of deaf children they encounter in the course of their delivery. Working with deaf children requires specialist knowledge and skills, particularly given the impact on their ability to access language and communication. We know that many small community-based organisations need support in these specialist areas, like accessing our growing library of resources in different languages, specialist knowledge around teaching deaf children, safeguarding, and using our research to build local solutions to specific challenges. So thank you very much indeed for being here today. Thank you too for our speakers for sharing their insights, particularly to Penny Innes, the head of Disability Inclusion team at the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, who will be sharing her insights and the department's learning in these areas. Finally, if at the end of this event you think that we might be able to work together to collaborate on a project, to provide specialist training to your teams, or to consult deaf children and young people on an aspect of your work, do reach out to us. We have one goal, and that is to make sure deaf children in developing countries get the support they need to succeed and thrive in life. And it's a pleasure to show you some of the work that we're doing to make this a reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for your introduction. Our next speaker is Joanna Clark, who will be talking us through the report and its findings. Joanna began her career in international development, managing the healthcare response to the Afghan refugee crisis in Pakistan in the 1990s, was Save the Children's country director in Vietnam for 5 years, and is an international development expert who specialises in children's health and education. Joanna has been director of Deaf Child Worldwide since 2013 and leads a team that works across East Africa and South Asia to make sure the barriers that prevent deaf children from succeeding in life are broken down. So thank you so much, Joanna, for taking us through the report today.
Thank you very much, Nick. And let me start by saying hello and a very warm welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to take a little bit of time just to go through the report and introduce it, but you should all have received a link this morning to the whole report, and I do hope you'll have time to go through it at your leisure after this. Before I talk a little bit more about what's in the report, I really want to take this opportunity to thank all our partners, both past and present, with whom we've worked so closely and continue to work, and without whom not only the report wouldn't be possible, but none of what we do would be possible. So thank you very, very much. We decided to put together this report to highlight some of the specific barriers that deaf children and young people and their families face. But as importantly, we also wanted to be able to show how some of the work that we've done has helped to make a real difference to the lives of deaf children. And we particularly wanted to highlight issues that or approaches that we think could be replicated more widely. Our main focus is working with deaf children themselves, with young people and with their families, and with the communities to really address the social barriers that hold deaf children back. Today is just a snapshot of our work, but we hope, we plan over the next few months to have a series of webinars where we can really talk about some of the issues that will come up today in a lot more detail. We decided to launch the report now, or I should say we really decided to launch it in April, but for obvious reasons we weren't able to. And we did it. We were going to launch it then because it was just beyond 30 years since the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child has put children at the centre of development. And it was also just over 25 years since the Salamanca Statement had actually got governments to agree to include children with disabilities in mainstream education. But of course, we're talking a generation ago then. Now, things have changed, and for the better, since then. And there are various policies and frameworks, not least of all the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Millennium and Sustainable Development Goals, which have really helped set frameworks for much more positive approaches and working. But unfortunately, we don't have to look very far to see that there's still a huge amount to do to make these commitments translate into real benefits for deaf and disabled children. For obvious reasons, as I said, we weren't able to go ahead with the launch in April. And we're now happy to welcome you online. But in fact, the COVID-19 pandemic has, for all the wrong reasons, made the report launch even more important, as we're seeing how these extraordinary circumstances of the last few months have really had an impact on deaf children and sadly for the most part, a fairly negative one. The information and the content of the report is informed by 20 years of Deaf Child Worldwide's work internationally, and it focuses particularly on projects that we have supported with our partners over the last 4 years or so. We also conducted some research last year with hundreds of deaf children and their families across the 5 countries we work in, so India, Bangladesh, and Uganda, Kenya and Tanzania. And the responses of all those who answered some of the research questions has informed the topics of the chapters to a large extent. And we had a fantastic response within the research, and so we feel this really gives a clear picture of where the concerns of deaf children and young people and their families. This translates into 5 chapters in the report, where we look at language and communication, at families, communities, education and independence. And I'll just run briefly through some of the key points from each of those chapters. It will only be a snapshot, as I said, and I do urge you to read the whole report when you get a chance. In terms of language and communication, this has to be chapter 1, really, because for deaf children, the first and most immediate challenge is learning to communicate in what is largely a hearing world, and making sure that deaf children have the right support to develop language, whether that be sign language or spoken language, is vital. More often than not, the children that we work with have been diagnosed late, if not at all, and many don't have access to hearing aids or any sort of technology, and certainly very, very few would have access at the moment to technology such as cochlear implants. And whilst we and our partners advocate strongly for better access to health services, for early diagnosis, more availability of technology, we do recognise that all of this will take time to achieve. It will also take significant investment on the part of governments and others to take something like that to scale. But in the meantime, children who don't have access to these services are being born or becoming deaf every day. And most of the examples in this report demonstrate ways in which these children can most effectively be supported and how they can be supported now. I think the critical factor is to start to support the child as soon as possible, and through family, through preschool, but primarily and first and foremost through the family. And this is the subject of the second chapter. Working with families is very much at the heart of what we do. And if deaf children do get the right support, it has to start at home. And this can be a huge challenge, mainly because most deaf children are born into families or into hearing families, and families who don't have any experience of deafness. So they often have very low expectations of their children and don't really understand anything about what it's like to be deaf or how to communicate with their child. So you'll see on this slide, we spend a lot of time working with and going on a journey with the families to, first of all, quite often help to reassure families that their child can learn and needs support, and that the families can give them support, even though they might not feel as if they can. So we work closely with families and with the deaf children to not only support them individually, but also to bring families together so that they can offer each other mutual support and moral support as well. And this can, over time, become really the most fundamentally important way to continue to help deaf children. So when we see some good examples, and you'll hear a little bit more later on from my colleagues from East Africa and South Asia about just how effectively families can work together to support their deaf children and other deaf children within their communities and more widely. And that takes us to communities, because obviously if barriers within the communities can be broken down, we know that this can dramatically increase the chances of deaf children to really thrive and succeed. And many people have never met a deaf child, or indeed met a deaf person, and they don't really know how to communicate with deaf children or quite what to do. On top of that, the responses are often clouded as well by, sadly, systemic rather than negative attitudes. But even more significantly, many deaf children themselves and their families have never met another deaf child or another deaf person. And so having role models and the work of role models who might be deaf staff, who might be community workers, who might be volunteers, is absolutely critical to the success of any project. And we would try to be creating opportunities as well for deaf children to meet other deaf children, so that they can actually learn to communicate with one another and move away from that terrible sense of isolation that deaf children can have, especially if they are not aware of anyone else in the same sort of situation. So the more deafness is understood, understandably, the greater the chances that the social and practical barriers will be lifted. So we work with our partners to raise awareness and conduct deaf awareness training with professionals, practitioners, decision makers at local and national levels, so that they do become more deaf aware. We also recognise amongst our colleagues within the sort of NGO sector that unless it is the specific focus of work, most NGOs understandably don't know very much about deafness or how to communicate with deaf children, which means that deaf children are often excluded from wider projects and programmes. So we have developed a training programme which, as well as focusing on training of trainers, is there to deliver deaf awareness training to other organisations. And we have developed a team where we will have 50% deaf and 50% hearing trainers. And when we do deliver training, we would always expect to have both a deaf and a hearing trainer delivering that to you. So if we will talk a bit more about that later, and the opportunities to look at what we might be able to offer on our website. So moving on to education, we do know that as children obviously head off and hopefully go to school, many deaf children find school to be extremely challenging. Some research that we carried out with our partner VSO in Kenya a couple of years ago, and backed up also by our experience of working in India in particular, allows us to say really with some confidence that the vast majority of deaf children who start primary school do so with very little language. And as a consequence of this, learning to read and write becomes a huge challenge. For this to be addressed in the longer term, teachers need to be consistently given the training and the resources they need to teach deaf children. Again, though, we do know that at the moment many children may be in school, but they aren't really learning. They're not really getting an education. This is a long-term issue in many respects, but there are smaller and simpler approaches and interventions that can be made which can make an immediate difference. And some examples from our projects which you'll see in the report, relate to introducing additional help in the classroom. So, for example, a deaf teacher working alongside a hearing teacher in the classroom to help keep the communication moving smoothly and to be able to communicate well with the children in the classroom. Another approach that you'll hear more about when one of my colleagues speaks later is about bringing more than one deaf, bringing several deaf children together in a classroom. In many deaf children who go to mainstream school may be the only deaf child in a school. So it's about bringing deaf children together so that they have other deaf children to communicate with, and they can be supported by community workers or volunteers or even parents outside the classroom to help give them that extra bit of support they need to be able to function at school. Another important side, especially within the mainstream school setting, is to work closely with the hearing peers of the deaf students. And we find that really they can be incredibly supportive and become incredibly interested in learning sign language, in mentoring and supporting their deaf peers. Using more visual aids in the classroom would seem to be an obvious approach when you're teaching deaf children. This doesn't always happen, but once it's introduced, it can have a huge impact on how a deaf child can really understand what's going on. And equally, it can have a huge impact for many of the hearing children in the classroom as well, who may themselves struggle with a lot of very heavily written information. And the more visual the teaching is, the better we find it is for all the children in the classroom. Sadly, over the last few months, as we know, the vast majority of schools, probably across the whole world, have been closed. And this has had a major impact on deaf children, which, of course, as yet, we can't fully recognise. And no doubt it's not deaf children alone. But deaf children have been even more isolated than usual. And it's been wonderful to see how governments and organisations and NGOs have put together lots of teaching materials that are available either online or more commonly through the television. And there's been a lot of creativity, but unfortunately a lot of these lessons haven't been very easily available to deaf children because most of them haven't had any sort of subtitling or sign language interpretation. So as one of the webinars we will be holding next year will be to look at in more detail at issues around education, and perhaps trying to be optimistic, we could say that if the COVID pandemic should by any chance lead to a fundamental rethink about how education is delivered, perhaps it could start by looking at how it could be delivered inclusively, rather than having inclusive education come as an afterthought, which is so often the case. Finally, the last chapter deals with independence. We work with young people up to the age of 25. And I think often when we talk about independence, the first thing that springs to mind is economic independence. But essentially, real independence relies on young people having the confidence and the resilience and having sort of access to the information they need to be able to make informed decisions about their lives. So very often the deaf young people we work with have had only limited access to formal education. And because of this, they can often have some fundamental gaps in knowledge and understanding, also related to not having had the same opportunities to develop fluent language. And this can make them extremely vulnerable to all kinds of abuse. So we work closely with young people to help them express their views, gain a greater understanding of how to manage relationships both outside and inside work. In particular, we've worked with deaf young people on issues of sexual and reproductive health to help them understand their rights and where to go for assistance if they need it. And at the same time, we've worked with service providers to help them make their services more accessible to deaf young people. In both East Africa and South Asia, many of our projects have helped young people to set up their own businesses and to get jobs. Most importantly, though, within any of these projects, we've worked first with the young people to understand their aspirations and the sort of support they need. And a piece of research we did a couple of years in South Asia actually found resoundingly that most young people, rather than setting up their own small businesses, which is quite often what is supported, really wanted, like most of us do, to have a paid job. But they saw this as an extremely difficult challenge, and indeed rightly so. So what we also try to do is recognise these challenges and work with potential employers to help them look at ways in which they can make their workplaces more deaf-friendly and accessible. And we've had our partners have had some major successes here with some large companies who have really stepped up to the mark. So that's really a very quick run through of what's in the report. It's only a brief snapshot, as I've said before. Please do take time to have a look in a bit more detail. And please do get back to us with any questions you might have. We'll be giving you contact details at the end of the session. And we really look forward to hearing from you, just to discuss some of the issues, to see if we can collaborate, or to see if there's anything we can do to assist in deaf awareness training in the future. Lastly, yet again, we will be conducting at least 5 webinars over the next year, trying to address in much more detail some of the issues in the chapters, and information about this is on the website, and more will be coming out over the next few weeks. So really look forward to this being the start of a discussion and a relationship with you all, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for sharing in so much detail the report and its findings. I've now got the pleasure of introducing Helen Kalinda from Deaf Child Worldwide's team in East Africa. Helen is going to share some of the experiences of deaf children growing up in East Africa today. Helen has also stepped in at the last moment due to illness in the team, so we are incredibly grateful for her time here today. And we seem to be having a couple of challenges getting the video of Helen here today. So I think what we will do to begin with, we will come back to that in a couple of moments. And instead, Joanna, would you like to introduce Penny, who's going to give our main talk today about international development in the UK, and we will come back to Helen and Nita later on to share some lived experience.
Hello, I'm afraid my video isn't working, but I would like to say thank you very much to Penny Innes, who is the head of the Disability and Inclusion team at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And sorry, I think I'm here now. So Thank you very much, Penny. I would ask you please to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you for that warm welcome. I'm here to join you this afternoon, and I just want to explain that the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office was created in September by merger between DFID and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So we're fairly new, and basically the team that I led from DFID, the Disability Inclusion Team, transferred over to cover the whole of FCEO, which is a much larger organisation, and therefore our scope is suddenly a lot larger as well. I wanted to start by acknowledging what a difficult year it has been for civil society. It's been a tough year for everyone, but I'm just really conscious that civil society organisations have seen the needs and the demand for their services and support really rocket, as Joanna was explaining, because of the COVID pandemic, and yet at the same time funding reduce or be uncertain. So I just wanted to thank you for all your amazing work, all those CSOs who are on the call today, and particularly to Deaf Child Worldwide for this really fantastic report with all its very constructive recommendations for us all. And of course, Thursday is International Day of Persons with Disabilities. So it's a really brilliant time to be looking at what more we can all do to support deaf children and all children with disabilities, and the lessons that we can learn from what has been done so far. And the challenges are greater as a result of COVID-19. We know that they've had a disproportionate impact on people with disabilities who are at greater risk of contracting the disease and then getting it more severely and at higher risk of death if they do contract it. And they also experience more secondary impacts because of loss of livelihoods, difficulties accessing school, and of course the stigma and discrimination that surrounds disability. And I also wanted to highlight that we are in the middle of the 16 days of activism against violence against women and girls. So it's also timely that we highlight the risk of violence that people with disabilities and women with disabilities and children are particularly at risk of, which is made worse by the pandemic for all the variety of reasons we're really familiar with lockdowns and stress from food insecurity, loss of livelihoods, etc. But of course, even before COVID-19 hit, half of children with disabilities were out of school and facing huge obstacles in getting to school, inaccessible buildings, transport, curricula that is not adapted, teachers not being prepared and trained, and segregation often. So there are just so many challenges, and so it's right for us to take a bit of time to look back at what we have achieved, what the UK government has been doing, and what we have learned from it. So I've been asked to speak a bit about what our work is doing to support children with disabilities, what we can learn from it, and what more we can all do. So first of all, what is the UK doing? Well, we want all disabled children to be able to fulfil their potential. And this means accessing a quality education that allows them to learn and to thrive. And we recently published a progress paper against our disability inclusion strategy, which sets out lots of examples of what we have done towards this goal amongst the other goals that we have, but particularly on this goal of education and the commitments that we set out in the strategy. And we didn't achieve everything that we set out to do. We set ourselves a very ambitious goal, and for a variety of reasons didn't quite get to everything that we planned to do. But the report sets out a huge amount of great work across many countries, and including our central teams as well. And that's due to my brilliant colleagues and also our brilliant partners that we work with all the time. And I'm really, really proud of what we've managed to achieve together over the last couple of years. And I just wanted to say a bit more about what we've done to support children, so particularly about supporting them into school and learning, and then pivoting in the light of the pandemic, and then a little bit about data. So we are supporting targeted interventions to increase the number of children with disabilities who can access education and improve their learning outcomes. And one major example of this is the Girls Education Challenge programme, which is a really big programme with lots of different projects within it. And that big programme overall has supported more than 100,000 girls with disabilities to attend school and to learn in countries like Kenya, Uganda, Sierra Leone and Zimbabwe. And just as one example, in Kenya, we're supporting Leonard Cheshire to work across 50 primary schools in the Lakes region to improve educational outcomes for disabled girls. And this is a very holistic approach, the sort of approach that's recommended in your report. So including teacher training, accessible infrastructure, psychosocial support and community engagement as well. And the results are really fantastic. So disabled girls' learning outcomes improved and their literacy targets were overachieved by 165% and their numeracy by a similar amount. So that's really great to hear. But we're also supporting governments to take action. So, for example, the government of Rwanda are developing a costed inclusive education plan and will be training 12,000 teachers on inclusion, which is one for each school in Rwanda. And they are also taking a holistic approach to the barriers in supporting children to learn. But of course, as I mentioned, a lot of this progress has been put in jeopardy this year. So I'll say a little bit about how our programmes have pivoted to respond to this. Just a few examples. So in Nepal and Kenya, we've partnered with VSO to develop life-saving, child-friendly messages about the pandemic in accessible formats, which include sign language. In Kenya and South Sudan, Leonard Cheshire is developing accessible materials to support learners and parents and communities during the school closures, while building the capacity of teachers to adapt their existing materials and deliver them online or via the phone, and also thinking about how to support deaf children. We've supported the expansion of sign language content being used in national TV education responses in Kenya. And throughout all of these examples, we're partnering with organisations of persons with disabilities so that we make sure our response is as inclusive as possible. So thirdly, I mentioned data as an example of what we have been doing. And without data, it's really harder to support children with disabilities and understand their needs. So we've been supporting UNICEF's Child Functioning module, which collects data on children with disabilities, and we're funding this to be used and developed further. And also UNESCO's Institute of Statistics to publish improved disability disaggregated education data. This year, we supported the publication of the Global Education Monitoring Report, which had a focus on inclusive education for the first time. So these, there's a long way to go, obviously, but these are some examples and some really key building blocks of how we can improve our approach and support children and improve our understanding of the challenges that they face as well. So I was asked to say a little bit about what we've learned. And what came to mind when I was thinking of this was a trip when I went to Uganda a couple of years ago in the days when we could travel, which seems a luxury now. And I remember in particular visiting a school where Leonard Cheshire was supporting disabled children into school. And it was a really wonderful environment because heads and teachers were really warm and welcoming. There were signs up around welcoming children with disabilities, and there were quite a lot of them in the school, and the buildings were accessible. And yet we saw the classrooms, which were packed with 100 children squeezed on benches, children right to the back of the classroom, and all of the teaching was by rote, or the teaching that we saw was by rote anyway. And so with children, with teachers asking questions and children chanting them back again. And we left wondering how many of the children in that school were actually learning very much. And so, and let alone the children who had a disability, how much they were learning. And we realised that what is needed in schools like that is a much more individual approach, where all children and all the different needs of all children are recognised and catered for. So getting disabled children into school is a wonderful start and will help to change attitudes and give them confidence and skills, but they also need to learn. And Joanna mentioned this, the whole education system needs to change to focus on individual child's needs. And this will benefit every child, of course, because there are those who can't see very well, who can't hear properly from the back of the classroom, even if their hearing is reasonably okay. And those who are anxious and those who can't concentrate, all the different needs need to be catered for. So one really big and challenging lesson is that country governments need to build their capacity. And we're trying to make this happen through, in some countries, through our Inclusive Education Initiative. So this is something that Norway, the UK and the World Bank are working together on to build the evidence base and test out what works at scale. So really, country-wide initiative. And it's working in Ethiopia, Nepal and Rwanda. And it's one of the things it's done is developed guidance on issues such as data collection, disaggregation and effective classroom support. And this year it has produced a paper on the experiences of disabled children in the pandemic. And again, it took a broad approach, so covering issues that are covered in your report, like remote learning, supporting families and parents, working with the community, the role of organisations of persons with disabilities, and then looking ahead at the post-pandemic and how we can reopen schools and how governments can support them to reopen safely. So we hope that the IEI, the Inclusive Education Initiative, will make progress in the 3 focus countries, but more importantly, we'll also share those lessons about a holistic, scaled approach in other countries and demonstrate what is possible. I have 2 other short, specific lessons from our work. The first is that there's often incoherence between policy and practice, which is often due to lack of join up or communication across government, something that happens in this country and in every government, I think. So as an example, in Nepal, where the IEI is working, it's supporting the development of an inclusive education strategy, which has really strong ministerial leadership. And yet at the same time, quite a lot of budget has been spent on building new special schools for children with physical and intellectual impairments. So contrary to the inclusive education strategy. And this is the messy world that we live in, the real world, where things are complicated and incoherent and people don't talk to each other. And so negotiating these inconsistencies is a real challenge for us and needs a coordinated approach across ministries so that finance is channeled really well. And secondly, another lesson is the potential of better disaggregated data. I mentioned the work earlier that we're doing on this. And every programme under the Girls Education Challenge programme, which I also mentioned, has used the Washington Group questions to disaggregate their data and understand the needs of the children they're supporting. And this has lots of benefits besides data collection. It helps general education practitioners to think about the children they're already reaching who might have invisible disabilities and how best to support them. And in fact, in Uganda, one project found that intersectionality is a more significant factor than impairment alone. So girls with disabilities with multiple levels of disadvantage have significant lower levels of literacy and numeracy compared with less marginalised disabled girls. So that made the project really think about how best they can support those children. So the collection of data can really have an impact on the educational approaches. So to finish, what more can be done? And I have 3 short suggestions on how we can work together towards our common goal. So the first is collaboration, and we must really collaborate between governments, between mainstream civil society, organisations of persons with disabilities, the private sector, families and communities as well. So we need really efficient ways to communicate and work together and break down silos and unhelpful incentives. And then we must also collaborate with organisations of persons with disabilities in a way that works for them, in a way that's respectful and with plenty of time for them to input. So yeah, so the first suggestion is collaboration more effectively. And secondly, of course, we know so well, is that the voices of people with disabilities must be heard, and parents of children with disabilities as well must be amplified so they are widely heard, because only they have the true lived experience of the barriers that exist for children, and they must be listened to and included and allowed to participate and supported to lead. That's so important. And then we must also work across the sectors, so across economic, social, cultural and protection sectors through multi-sectoral approaches, because the needs of children are complex, and we need to look at their care, their safety, their well-being, their education. And that's the approach that we took in our 2018 education policy, and it is still our aim as well, to join up services so that they meet the needs of the individual child. So, as your report highlights so well, there are many challenges, but there are also ways to support that we know are successful, and we must all really work together so that we can support children who have so much potential and deserve to live fulfilling lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Penny. That was an incredibly insightful and helpful kind of discussion about so many of the challenges faced and the work that you and the department are doing.
Nick, you've just gone on mute.
Oh, apologies. It is not an underestimation to say that you are one of the real experts on this, and it is an absolute pleasure to have you here today and your constant engagement with the work that we are doing to support deaf children around the world. So we will try and show you a short talk from Helen now, talking about some of the lived experience of deaf children in East Africa.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're listening us from. My name is Helen Kalinda, and I work for Deaf Child Worldwide in East Africa. In my presentation, I'll be talking about the deaf child in East Africa today. Kenya has made tremendous progress in advancing the rights of the deaf child. From birth, the child will be screened for any disability, and parents will be advised accordingly. Many deaf children in Kenya, if they are diagnosed, will now be able to get cochlear implants or hearing aids. However, these two things are still very expensive, and many parents cannot afford them. There are schools for the deaf, mostly residential schools, that are spread across the country. There's also some mainstream schools which have special units for deaf children. Residential schools, of course, are there, but they're not evenly spread, so parents will have their children walk travel distances to access education. Teachers teaching in these schools use Kenya Sign Language, but most teachers are not proficient in sign language, so they struggle to communicate with the children or the pupils. Unfortunately, a majority of the deaf young person do not have jobs or the necessary skills for them to compete and take up the jobs in the job market. And most services for deaf children and young people still remain inaccessible to date in Kenya, including the most important health services. When we move to Uganda and Tanzania, the picture is very different. Many deaf children from Uganda and Tanzania come to Kenya or other countries in the region for better services or medical services. In Uganda and Tanzania, very few schools for the deaf. There are very few schools for the deaf. In Uganda, learners are taught in Uganda Sign Language, while in Tanzania, they use Tanzanian Sign Language in schools, especially in the lower classes. But majority of the learners have to lip read to understand the teacher and hearing peers. Imagine how hard that is. Generally, in East Africa, awareness about deafness is still lagging behind, and many people have negative stereotypes and views about deafness. Some parents are still struggling to accept their kids' deafness, while I know of a significant number of fathers who have separated from their wives. And the reason is they accuse them of conceiving a deaf child outside wedlock because they think that deafness is inherited and not definitely from their side. So what we think should be done to support deaf children growing up in East Africa are very key. So first and foremost, we feel that deaf awareness should be done across the region. This will help to break down negative attitudes and stereotypes, which are the biggest obstacle facing deaf people in the region. More awareness needs to be done, especially in communities and professionals, so that they're able to see deaf people from a very positive perception. It will see parents doing everything they can to ensure that their deaf children excel in their studies. We also think and believe that reducing the cost of services for deaf people is also a big barrier which needs to be addressed and broken down. Hearing assessment, sign language interpretation services, hearing aids, cochlear implants, speech therapy, deaf schools are all extremely costly for all families, and almost all families in East Africa. So, and the quality of education is another thing that we think we need to address. Education in East Africa, especially for deaf children and their families, need to improve. Many deaf children don't go to school, but those that do often do not receive high quality education, and this we believe needs to change. Most deaf children, young people, and adults in the region use sign language to communicate, but most parents have no support to learn sign language, or if they do, it's very expensive. This causes huge challenges for their deaf children and entrenches inequalities where parents and their children cannot communicate with each other. Because of these problems in deaf young people and children getting an education, there are also barriers for deaf young people transitioning into adulthood. They need support to move into work, to get practical skills for work and employment, and to start their own businesses so that they're able to provide for their own family and be economically independent. So at Deaf Child Worldwide, we are working with partners across the East Africa region to make sure that these barriers are broken down and addressed and ensure that deaf children and young people get the start in life that they all need. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Helen, and for stepping in at the last moment as well. Can I now introduce Nita Gopali Krishnan? Nita has a long experience working with the deaf community in India, as well as her own personal experience growing up within the deaf community. Nita is going to talk briefly about some of the projects and programs that can make a huge impact on a deaf child's life, and share some of those experiences with us today.
Hello, I'm Nita Gopalakrishnan, the Technical Advisor on Deafness for Deaf Child Worldwide South Asia. Today, I'd like to talk about two projects that we are running to break down the barriers that deaf children in India are facing. The first project is with the Partner Association of People with Disabilities on developing model schools. The villages in India are so widely spread, close to about 40 kilometers of distance between each of them. The deaf children in these villages go to the local government schools, where they are probably the only deaf child, not only in the school, but in the entire village. The school and the teachers are unable to support the deaf child in terms of improving their language, communication, and learning. They are unable to teach concepts in a way that they are able to understand. So the project identified 5 model schools where each of the school would have the deaf children from the neighboring villages coming in. So there were 10 deaf children in each of these model schools who were supported with trained deaf and hearing teachers who would go to these schools every day. Apart from being in the regular classrooms, the deaf children got the support from these trained teachers. They had the opportunity to meet other deaf peers who otherwise they would have never met, being isolated in their own villages. They also had the opportunity to see a role model, a deaf teacher who would teach them to communicate and improve their language. So the biggest impacts that we saw from this project is that there was improved language and communication of the deaf children. It could be seen in the confidence that they had in communicating with people who are new and they're meeting for the first time. The parents had also good feedback that the children would come back home and have lots of stories to tell about what happened in school, which otherwise they had never seen. And the other big impact was that the school was growing to be more deaf-friendly. One such instance is that morning assembly that they have. So the hearing peers, the classmates of the deaf children who had learned sign language, would interpret the morning assembly where the daily news or some facts were being read out. The assembly would end with the ritual of singing the national anthem, and now it was being sung in sign language. So the deaf children were also being included and they felt being a part of the school. So this model school concept or this model is being presented to different authorities, which we are hoping will be taken up and run forward. The second project that I'd like to talk about is with the partner Samuha, where we wanted to support parents of deaf children to effectively raise their children. So 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. So the parents feel isolated, they feel lonely without support systems or networks where they can get advice or reassurance of how to bring up their deaf child. So what the project did is gave a forum, brought in deaf parents of deaf children from these different villages together, created a group where they had this support system. So through the support from the DCW, the parents were reassured and they felt that yes, they could support and bring up their deaf child, not only bringing up the deaf child, but also support them in learning, improving their language and communication. So that was a big impact, that these parents set up their own learning centers. So there are now 13 learning centers across the project area where the parents went to the local government, Gram Panchayat, and asked for spaces to set up these learning centers. So 13 of these parents now visit the learning center once a week, which is a huge responsibility apart from their regular household and family responsibilities. They've taken it on themselves to support their deaf child and other deaf children whose parents are unable to support and give time. So this was the biggest impact. And we see that this is a model that can sustain because the capacity and the responsibility now lies with the parents and the community who are now empowered and they see that they are able to support the deaf children. So at Deaf Child Worldwide, we collaborate with so many organizations to design such projects. We work with anywhere from small community-based organizations to working with large national organizations where we deliver training to make sure that the staff understand the unique needs of the deaf children and to model or design their programs to make big impacts on the lives of deaf children and their families. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Nita for sharing her experiences of the projects we run in India and in Bangladesh. So we're now going to have a question and answer session, and thank you so much for sending so many questions through on the Q&A box below. Keep sending those through. I can't promise we'll get through all of them in the time we have left, but we will do our best. And if not, you can email us afterwards and we'll be writing a blog up about the event as well. So we'll hopefully get through lots of these. We have Penny Innes from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. We have Joanna Clark, Director of Deaf Child Worldwide, Susan Daniels, our Chief Executive, and Nita Gopalakrishnan from Deaf Child Worldwide's South Asia team. So the first question we've got is for you, Susan. Deaf Child Worldwide has been going for nearly 20 years now. How has the experiences and the situation for deaf children in low-income countries changed in the last 20 years?
Thank you, Nick. I think that's an interesting question. Obviously, there has been, I think, a lot of positive developments in the sense that there is more awareness of the needs of deaf children. There are more organisations that are expressing an interest to work in this area. I still think we have massive challenges around supporting deaf children from the point at which the family starts to identify that there is an issue and develop that language and communication, ensuring that the child is really able to take part in those family conversations in whatever method of communication the family is using, but also to ensure that they have full access in education and then can go on to employment. So I think a lot has improved, but there's still a lot to do, which is really where Deaf Child Worldwide comes in.
Thank you, Susan. We've got a question here for you, Penny. We've seen, and you mentioned in your talk that there has been a huge growth in the kind of global interest and concerted political will to make sure that girls get an education, and there have been some fantastic projects and programs to do that. How do we get the same global concerted political will to support disabled children and deaf children to get a world-class education? Do you think it's possible and something that's achievable?
Well, I think it is possible and achievable. I think in a way you have to use the political moments that you get. So, we found a couple of years ago we had huge focus on disability from our Secretary of State. In fact, two, Priti Patel first, who was International Development Secretary, and then Penny Mordaunt. And it was because of their leadership that we led the Global Disability Summit in 2018 and were able to develop our strategy for the whole of DFID, which was the first disability inclusion strategy. And so there are moments that you have to capitalise on. And I think there's one at the moment for girls' education. And so the task for us as a community is to make sure that it isn't just able-bodied girls, but girls with disabilities that benefit from that. And keep making the case for disability, and then there'll be new opportunities. So I think for next year, the opportunities we should have in mind, there's two. One is COP26 and climate change, and how do we make sure that that is an inclusive event and supports all people with disabilities, including children. And then after that, Norway is going to hold the second Global Disability Summit, which I expect, I don't know for sure, but I expect education to continue to be on their agenda because the government of Norway are doing so much. So that would be another key moment for us to really come together as a community for children with disabilities.
Thanks so much, Penny. There's a question coming from Khaled in the chat, and he's asking, and I think probably for you, Joanna, Technology is obviously, a huge area of change and growth in the last couple of years. What is the impact of technological change and new technologies being more available had for deaf children growing up and improving their access to language, communication and education?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I mean, obviously, there is a lot of progress being made in technology on all fronts. I think the real issue for the children that we and our partners work with is getting access to this technology. And obviously, every child is different. Some deaf children will benefit from technology and want it, and some may not. But it's a question of really being able to have that choice. And at the moment, there isn't that choice for most of the children we work with. And this is why, as I think I said earlier, it is, to a large extent, it's beyond the scope of individual organisations, and it is a collective responsibility across everyone working with deaf and disabled children to try to make this happen. But certainly it has the potential to make a big difference, and I think we see that in countries such as the UK, where it has made a difference. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I'm afraid at the moment we don't see too much indication of the benefits it's given to the children we work with.
Can I go across to Nita and ask you, Nita, in South Asia and where we work in India and Bangladesh, is technology becoming much more of a force for good to support deaf children, or is it similar that the most vulnerable and disadvantaged deaf young people still just don't have access to that?
Thank you for that question, Nick. Actually, you're right. I mean, the technology aspect after COVID has really taken up a big space in the education sector. So the urban areas do see a lot of usage of technology and learning happening through that. But in the rural areas, which covers about 80% of India, if I can say, still don't have the technology support in terms of access to Wi-Fi or internet and different devices. So that is still a challenge in the rural areas, but we are seeing some major companies coming up and working in that area. It will take a long time to get there, and where technology is completely taken into account. Good question.
Thanks very much, Nita. Joanna, we've got a question about coronavirus and the pandemic that we're living through at the moment. What do you think the biggest challenges are coming out of this pandemic? What are the big experiences deaf children are facing that need to be broken down specifically because of the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, it's early to say exactly what, but I think along with probably every other child practically in the world at the moment, the biggest impact will be on education. But I think it's a particular issue, as I mentioned when I was speaking for deaf children, because a lot of the real innovative approaches that there have been to try to get some of the lessons and so on online or on TV quite often don't reach deaf children. And I think, again, along with a lot of other children from much more economically vulnerable families, we may find that some children feel that it makes more sense to go out to work after this if they can get a job rather than go back to school. So I just think there are going to be so many issues. And, for us, again, I think it brings us back to really the need to work very closely with families and look at how children can be supported to some extent catch up on what they've missed out on, but not at the same time slip a long way behind. But I think I think education is going to be an absolutely key focus in the future to really see what needs to be done differently. And as I said, maybe it's an opportunity to consider what should have been done differently before the pandemic as well.
Thanks very much, Joanna. I know we're running to time, but we will stay open for a couple more minutes just to answer a couple more questions. But I appreciate if some people do need to go, that is absolutely fine. We've got a question here about data collection, which I think is probably a good one for you, Penny, with your experience with the challenges in this area. In Uganda, Paul is saying that data collection and getting accurate, robust data about the number of children who are deaf is a real challenge. Are there any tips for how you can best engage, whether it's service design, whether it's working with governments, or it's more practical work on the ground to make sure we get as robust and accurate data as possible?
Thank you. I suppose the answer that I would point to is the Washington Group Questions tool, because we know that if you ask, just the question, do you have a disability, you get very low response rates in many countries, largely because of the stigma and discrimination associated with disability. So it's better to ask questions about sort of impairment and more sort of factual questions about impairment. And there's this set of, there's a variety of different tools within the Washington Group Questions. There's a longer set, but there's also a short set of 6, which can be expanded to include questions on psychosocial disability as well. And these can be used in surveys and even censuses, actually. I think, in fact, Uganda, I think they have included them in the census. It's not without difficulty because the questions do need some training in order to operate them effectively, but that training in itself helps to improve awareness and attitudes around disability. So there's a lot of benefits of using those questions and collecting data.
Thanks so much, Penny. We've had a couple of questions come in about the position of kind of changes within UK aid, the news recently that the UK government was going to scale back some of its budget for international development work. I guess question for Joanna and a question for Penny. Penny, are we still going to be doing lots of fantastic work and continuing lots of the fantastic programs you've been speaking about to do with disability and disability inclusion? And Joanna, is this something you're concerned about or worried about for the impact on the work of Deaf Child Worldwide?
So if I go first, so it's a real shame, and we were all really disappointed about the news last week, but I think it just is a factor of the really unprecedented situation we are in and the impact on the UK economy. So it's just a difficult situation and government having to make difficult choices. So I think that the programmes will continue. I don't know exactly how, and there will be a process now to look at our programmes and the impact on next year's, with the reduction in next year's budget. I don't know how that will work out yet. We've had several prioritisation exercises this year and have managed to protect the programme. So I'm very much hoping we'll be able to do the same.
Fantastic. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thanks, Nick. Maybe just from me, I mean, I do think that UK international development work has always been held up as being some of the best in the world, and I think hopefully it will continue to be that, and I'm sure it will. And we've heard from Penny about the focus of the work, and that it's really reassuring to hear that still is maintained, the focus on disabled children. I think from our point of view, of course, again, I would agree with what Penny said. I think probably everyone listening here today is disappointed that the government contribution will go down. On the other hand, I think, like everything else, we have to look at then how we sort of focus the work, how we really learn from the work we're doing, and collaborate much more closely, again, as Penny was saying, to see how we can really make the most of what we can do with what we have, learn from it, and disseminate the lessons more widely. And I think from Deaf Child Worldwide's point of view, I mean, we are a small organisation. We are quite fortunate in having various resources to draw on. So we don't see it immediately impacting on our own direct work, but obviously, you know, we're not working in isolation. We all have to work together to make this happen. And you know, we hope that after this next year or so, when we all have a bit of a better idea what on earth's happening to the world, that, you know, maybe the government will decide to go back up to 0.7. We never know, but we can but hope. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Joanna. There's a question that's come in here asking whether we do any work specifically in fragile states, conflict states, and in those kind of extreme humanitarian situations. Is this an area, Joanna, where I know your background very much started working in this area, and you did a lot of work in refugee camps after the Afghan refugee crisis in the 1990s. Is this an area you're interested in, where you think that Deaf Child Worldwide could work in the future?
But I mean, I think it's a critical area, obviously. It's not an area that Deaf Child Worldwide would focus on, because again, as I mentioned earlier, we are really quite small. We have to think about where to focus our resources and really what expertise we can bring. But what I would say is that, you know, I think the fundamental principles are the same for working with deaf and disabled children in a refugee situation as they are in any other situation. It's just that obviously it's even more challenging. And I think where, you know, the way that a small organisation like Deaf Child Worldwide would want to expand, if that's the right word, would be to really offer our expertise through training to other organisations that may have different resources to be, you know, physically available in other parts of the world. But we would not be doing that ourselves. But again, it comes back to the whole reason for us having this webinar is that we would like to be able to offer whatever expertise we could to those who are.
Thanks very much, Joanna. Just before we wrap up, question for Nita, asking about how important deaf role models are. And from your work in South Asia, do you think, we know 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents with no previous experience of deafness. Do you think making sure that those young people have role models, have deaf adults that they can know they're not alone is really important? And is that something you prioritise in your work in South Asia?
Thank you again, Nick. Yes, absolutely. I mean, working with deaf peers or deaf role models is really key. And especially in the area that we are working in, or the country that we are in, where the rural area is about 80%, like I said before. So, and the villages are so far away from each other. So the isolation is not a big surprise to us at all. They're probably deaf child who's there sitting in one village and not having any knowledge that there is some other person just like me. So they grow up not knowing what really deafness means and having a positive identity about themselves. So it is very key that they meet other deaf peers and have good role models who can then encourage them to understand, yes, I am also able to I can achieve my dreams. Rather than sitting in a place where they're unable to communicate because there's lack of understanding about deafness, lack of what are the language needs, the communication needs of deaf children. Like what Helen, my other colleague, said about lack of deaf awareness, which is a big key. So having these role models really help them, not only the deaf children, but the parents as well, because they are
they're feeling very sad at the first, right? That they've got a deaf child, and never have they seen a deaf child in their family. So they don't know how to bring up a deaf child. What are the needs? How do I cope with their education, their future? And all of those questions are always lingering in their head. So having these deaf role models really help them to understand what better future holds for their deaf child.
Thank you, Nita.
Yeah, thank you.
And just a final.
Definitely make sure that we've got deaf role models as teachers and staff working in all of our projects. So that is key, and we make sure that all our projects have good deaf role models. Sorry, thank you.
No, sorry for interrupting you, Nita. And just a final question before we wrap up for Susan. We've got several international development agencies here today who don't specialise in deafness, but have many deaf children who access their projects and their programmes. What are the key things that they should be factoring into their programming as non-specialists in deafness?
Thank you for the question. Yes, so I think it's incredibly important that organisations that are potentially working with deaf children within their programmes do get in touch with us, because I think it's impossible to underestimate the impact that deafness has on a child's ability to be able to communicate with their family and their peers, and that requires specialist intervention, which is exactly what Deaf Child Worldwide has been set up to do. So we're able to provide that support, advice, training, and really enable organisations to support very effectively the deaf children that they're working with. So we'd be delighted to be contacted by any organisation in that situation that really wants to kind of up the ante in terms of the quality of the support that they provide.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you so much to all of our panellists here today. We've well and truly gone over time, so I can only apologise for that, but I think that was an incredibly useful, interesting and engaging discussion. So thank you so much. Please do read the reports. Get in touch with us if you have any questions at all. There are some email addresses and contact details on the screen now. In the new year, we will be running several webinars to get under the skin of some of these issues much more, and we would love it if you came along. I know we've not got through all of the questions here today, but we will have time to discuss them in more detail with different academics and experts and things like that. Equally, if you'd like to get in touch about collaboration around training and the training offer that Deaf Child Worldwide has, or about any consultancy work that we could do get in touch and we can start a conversation. So thank you again, and thank you so much for all coming here today. That is the end of our event.
Thank you.
Thank you.